Okay, so the class, let me just do one more thing here. Okay. All right, so I apologize. I was going to have it also on Facebook Live, but it doesn't seem to be working at this point in time. So I apologize to those people. Here we go. All right, we'll figure it out as time goes on. In any event, this Shir actually is the Shir I gave on Shavuos night. So I don't believe either of you were there. Is that correct? Natan, were you in at Shir Hadash?
No.
No, I don't think so.
I'm sorry. I've never been this incompetent before. Okay, so let me just give you a quick overview of what this class is in general each week. I took the book called the Sefer HaChinuch, which is called the Book of the Mitzvot, or the Book of Education. He counts all 613 commandments, and he counts them as they appear in the Torah. In other words, the mitzvah of pru'ervu, of having children, that appears in Breshit. The mitzvah of Brit Milah, that appears in Breshit. He only has about 3 mitzvot in Sefer Breshit. The other one is Gita Nasheh, of not eating the sinew of a certain animal because Yaakov, our forefather, wrestled with an angel, and it says there that he injured his Gita Nasheh, and therefore we don't eat it to remember that. So the Sefer Chinuch basically follows the order of the Torah. This is a shir that I started giving a few years back, in fact, and we've gone through 125 mitzvot already out of the 613. And what I try to do in each class is go according to the order of the Sefer Chinuch. He first tells you a little bit about the mitzvah. First tells you the mitzvah, where it appears in the Torah, what's the biblical source. He then tries to give an explanation of what the mitzvah, what is the meaning behind the mitzvah, and then he gives some of the practical halachot, and then also the whether or not it's applicable in today's time. Hi, Lois. Nice to see you. So
it's Michael.
Michael, I'm sorry. See, I can't really see you. I only saw the. So that's the structure of the Sefer Chinuch. The truth is we don't spend so much time on the Sefer Chinuch, but I'm following the order in which he goes, and he's sort of the jumping off point for the class. So as I said, we've done about 125 of these mitzvot. I was looking back around Shavuos time if I had missed any in the first 100 or so, and I realized I missed these 2 mitzvot. I missed the mitzvahs number 40 and number 41. So that's what we're going to speak about today. What we're probably going to do as we go forward is I gotten a little bit of an interest in mitzvot that are connected to the land. That's Shemitah. That's we have fruit trees in the shul. So the questions of orla, when you're allowed to take the fruit off the tree, how many years, how you do issues of tithing the fruits. There's a whole series. There's probably about 45 different mitzvot connected to farming. And so what we probably will do as a block beginning next week is to look at some of those mitzvot according to the Sefer Chinuch. So we're going a little bit out of order in a little bit. Let me start now with the mitzvah we're going to actually learn tonight. The mitzvah we're going to learn tonight, as I said, it's actually 2 of them, number 40 and 41. 40 is the main mitzvah, but you'll see that 41 is also connected. In the Sefer Chinuch, I put the source sheets on the Facebook page, and if I was on my computer Zoom, I would share my screen, but I don't think I have that ability. Let's see if I could do it. Do either of you, or do any of you have the source sheets? Oh, you know what? Let's see. says that I'm not able to. Okay, it says that I'm not able to share the screen. So I will read out the sources so that you know what I'm talking about. We begin with the mitzvah number 40. And just in terms of to contextualize it, we're in the end of Parshat Yitro. In the end of Parshat Yitro, we've just heard the 10 Commandments. In fact, the first source that I bring is the very end of the 10 Commandments. Lo tachmod beit re'echa, right? Don't covet your neighbor's house. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. It continues with the concluding statements of the 10 Commandments. And then it says the people are fearful of everything they just heard. And Moshe tells them, Al tira'u, don't be fearful. God was testing you. They say that we're going to follow everything that was just said. And then God adds an additional sort of conclusion to the 10 Commandments that make sure they follow everything that I've just told them. Make sure that they don't create any forms of idol worship. Don't create any graven images. And then it has 2 additional verses, which we'll read in just a moment. And then it jumps to Mishpatim, the next parsha. And when we go to Mishpatim, it's all of the specific laws. So you have these grand laws of the 10 Commandments, and then you have the specific laws of Mishpatim. And in between that are sandwiched these 2 verses that are the source of the 2 mitzvot we're going to learn tonight. One says as follows, Mizbeach Adama, that you will create a altar out of earth, Taseli v'zavachta alav, and you'll make it for me, and you will sacrifice your animals on that, your elevation offerings and your peace offerings and your sheep and your cattle, in every place that I will cause my name to be mentioned, and I will give you blessings. The im mizbeach, and the if mizbeach havanim, if the altar that you make is made out of stone, right? The first commandment is make it out of earth. But if you make it out of stone, tasili lotvena item, you should make sure that that stone is not gazit. Gazit is a word we'll have to look at a little bit more carefully, but it means hewn, right? Cut. You should not make it a cut stone with iron.
That's a very obscure rule.
A very obscure rule, right? You should not put any iron onto the stone, because otherwise you will desecrate it. So, what's the problem of putting iron onto a stone? These are the stones that were used for the altar in the Beit HaMikdash. So, by the way, the last verse before we go into the actual Mishpatim, the last verse adds, by the way, the ramp that goes up. Oh, there's feedback, I think. Okay, I'm going to shut one of my things. Hopefully that will stop the feedback. The ramp that goes up. When you go up to the altar, you should not reveal your nakedness. And then we go into Mishpatim. Okay. Let me see what I can do here.
Can you mute us?
Michael, I think you're. Okay. Okay. Is that any better?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, great. Technology is amazing, but of course you also have challenges. Okay, so the main mitzvah that I want to look at is, it says, when you build an altar, that altar cannot have any hewn stones, cannot have any stones made out of where you brought iron in order to cut them. What's the reason behind that? So the Sefer Chinuch says, if you have the source sheet, mitzvah number 40, you're not to build with hewn stones, that we should not build an altar of stones that metal would touch, as it's stated in Exodus 20:22. That's what we've just quoted. Do not build a gazit stones. The explanation of hewn gazit stones, according to the Ramban, is that we chisel the stone with an iron tool. And also the altar should not be built with hewn stones. It is disqualified. What is the roots of this commandment? We should fix into our souls from the day that we make the altar that forgiveness of iniquity, blessing, and peace will come through the altar. When you build this mizbeach, when you create the Beit HaMikdash or the Mishkan, that's going to create peace. It's going to create a love and harmony. We should therefore remember that we are commanded not to do anything upon it with tools that are fit for destruction. Right? If you are using metal is used for making swords, making spears, making instruments of war. They're for destruction. Those are things that kill people. Those are things that spill blood. And the whole purpose of the Mizbeach and the Beit HaMikdash is to bring people together, is to bring us closer to God. I would point out, for example, the word religion. I've made this point before. Religion comes from the word Latin religia, which means to connect, like ligament. So the whole purpose of religion is to connect. So it's supposed to connect people. It's supposed to connect us to God. And the metal symbolizes items that are made out of war. And so therefore, he relies heavily on symbolism. That's one of the Sefer Chinuch makes this point quite often. He says that a man acts according to his actions and his thoughts follow his deeds. It's not simply you should think something, but you should actually do it. And if you make sure that you don't use metal, that will remind you that you should not be engaged in making war and the purpose of the Beit HaMikdash. It is therefore fitting us with symbolic actions according to the intentions of things. He's very high on symbolism. He actually makes it a little bit, the point even stronger in the next mitzvah, mitzvah number 41, which is you're not supposed to go up the steps, right? There should be no steps on the altar. The simple understanding is the Kohanim, if they took steps, they would reveal themselves, right? They would have these garments and the stairs would somehow see their nakedness, and that would be an embarrassment to them. And he goes and says, obviously the stones don't see the nakedness of the Kohanim. It's all symbolism, but symbolism plays a big role in our lives. It has an impact on our lives, and therefore we make sure that it's a ramp to teach us the importance of symbolism. And then he also talks about how this ramp too, we should be very careful that no metal ever touches it. Again, with the concept of the symbolism of metal and the war. So that's the sort of the opening point of that. Where does he get this from? It's not from nowhere that he does it. It's from the Mishnah in Midot, the 3rd chapter. The mitzvah says explicitly, both the stones for the ramp as well as the stones for the altar. Where did they come from? Bikat Beit Kerem, right? You know where Beit Kerem is today, like Shari Tzedek? There used to be open fields, and they would dig up stones, whole stones from that area. The Chofrim Lamata, they would dig into virgin soil. Mevi Misham Avanim Shlemot, and they would bring whole stones, completely whole stones that they did not cut. Shalohunaf Alehem Barzel, no metal, no iron whatsoever came upon them. And if iron in any way touched them, then the entire process was considered puzzle, a failure. Shehabarzel nivra lekatzer yamav shel adam, because the purpose of iron was created in order to cut down the lives, shorten the lives of human beings, and the Mizbeach was created in order to extend the lives. So that's the Mishnah in Midot. And so therefore, because the purpose of the Mizbeach is to teach peace, therefore we cannot have anything that has to do with war connected to it. I would add one other point. There's a number of ways in which the Mizbeach, the altar, brought peace. Right? It brings peace between us and God. But just the Tosefta that I brought is an interesting case. He says the Tosefta, Rabbi Shimon states, in the very way the offerings were brought, why are the shlamim, peace offerings. Why are they called peace offerings? Because everyone got a piece of it, right? That's not what it's not the English, but in the fact that everyone got a piece of it. In other words, the Kohen got some, God got some, the person who brought the sacrifice got some. Because everyone got a little bit of the meat that was brought, everyone was happy. Everyone felt that they had what they needed, and therefore it created shalom, peace between people. This concept that we should not have metal connected to symbolism that has to do with peace has actually practical halachot references, manifestations, even today. For example, do any of you have the custom of covering the metal knife on your table when you cut bread, after you finish cutting bread? No. Okay. Those who do have that custom, and many, in fact, say that it's not just a custom, but it's a halacha during the course of the week, is if the bread is on the table, the knife should either be off the table or the knife should be covered when it's not in use. Because your table represents your altar, right? Your table represents your mizbeach, and that's actually how you bring peace into the world, when you provide hospitality to people, when you have, you give the good fellowship, company, food. There's actually a very interesting minhag. Some people, they used to do in Europe that a portion of your table, like a leg or something like that, would be cut off and would be buried with you when a person would pass away, because it would argue in front of God what you did with your table, because it's your mizbeach, was able to bring peace between people. And so the knife symbolizes the metal that could kill, and so therefore you should cover it, you should hide it. It shouldn't be there. There's an argument of whether or not that applies on Shabbat. Some argue that the real reason why we don't have knives on the table uncovered is because people would get so depressed that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, they would stab themselves. Seems a little bit of an extreme opinion, but according to that opinion, you don't have to worry about it on Shabbat, because on Shabbat itself is compensates for the lack of the Beit HaMikdash. Anyway, that aside, that's one custom. There's another custom the Baal Shem Tov says, which he says you should not have your mezuzot made out of metal, because the mezuzah also is meant to bring about peace, and therefore you shouldn't make it out of metal. Not as many people follow that. Actually, at the shul, we actually have metal mezuzot on the outside doors, but that's another idea from the Baal Shem Tov. And in Israel, it's actually a very practical halacha, which relates to soldiers. When soldiers come into a Beit Knesset, are they allowed to have their guns with them? It's not a hypothetical question. Obviously, it happens quite all the time. So there's a Gemara in I think it's Shabbat. Yeah, the Mishnah is the source Shabbat. If you have the source sheets, Shabbat 63 Aleph. The Mishnah says, Lo yetzeh ish lo b'saif. This is describing a case of a person who is carrying on Shabbat. Right now, we're not talking about weapons per se, but there's a prohibition of carrying on Shabbat if there's no Eruv. However, if what you're carrying is actually a part of your garment, right? If it's your hat, your glasses, if it's a pendant, if it's part of your garments, it's an adornment, so then it's permitted to be carried. So the Mishnah says as follows: Lo yitzeh ish lo b'sif, that a person should not go out with his sword or with his bow, and then it lists a whole series of other weapons. Krudgel is one translation. I don't know what that is in English, let alone in Hebrew. And you shouldn't go out with all these things. The im yatzah, and if you go out and you carry these items, chayiv chatat, you have to bring a sacrifice. You sin. That's the opinion of the Chachamim. The Rabbi Eliezer, however, says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, takshitim hen lo. For him, the sword, like they have Sikhs. Sikhs always have a sword as part of their garments. So maybe it's like an adornment for him. He was wearing it almost like a piece of jewelry. He's wearing the sword not because he's going to kill someone, but it's like in Buckingham Palace. The swords they have, it's an adornment of their uniform. It makes them look, more regal. So people wore certain weapons as adornment. So the Rabbi Eliezer says they can carry it because it's just in that sense like an adornment, almost like jewelry in their clothing. However, the rabbis respond to Rabbi Eliezer and say, "Eno el legnai." This is nothing but a disgrace to wear swords and things like that. And then he quotes the famous pasuk from Isaiah that we should turn our swords into plowshares and never make war anymore. The sort of messianic vision of there being peace between everyone. And so you have this argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. Now, one thing I'd like to say about the rabbis is as follows. It's not that they never allow a person to have a sword, meaning if there's a danger, if it's a matter of self-defense, the person is allowed to carry the sword. But what they are saying is don't call them an adornment. Don't call them takshitim. Don't call them part of your garments. They're nothing but a disgrace. They may be a necessary disgrace, but don't forget that the ultimate goal is that we have nothing to do with war, nothing to do with weapons whatsoever. So on a practical term, when the question is asked of Israeli soldiers today, what do they do with their weapons? So ideally is they shouldn't bring their weapons into shul at all. However, we understand that there's a matter of self-defense and security. And so the rabbis have basically said they need to bring in their weapons. If it's not a time of particular danger, what they should do is they should take out the magazine, or they should cover the weapon, or they should put the weapon on the floor. In a sense, it's sort of taking away at least the appearance, right? It's sort of out of sight, out of mind, takes away the appearance of the violence of that weapon. If, however, the rabbis go a step further, if we're talking about a time of actual danger, so then, and they need every second counts, they can leave their weapons uncovered, they can leave the magazines in and everything along those lines. But that's the preference is that they should be hidden or at least covered because of this particular halakha. So the question then becomes as follows. This is all very interesting. It's a nice symbolic point about making peace, not war, and everything along those lines. But if you can't bring the iron to cut the stones that are going to be used on the altar, and some even extend that to be used even in parts of the Beit HaMikdash, how in the world do you cut these stones? How do you frame stones so that you can build something? So the traditional answer is offered. It's by way of a miraculous something, and I'm purposely saying something right now because the Gemara is not clear. A miraculous something called the Shamir. The Shamir, most people think of it is some type of worm that had incredibly strong teeth, and that you could somehow guide the little worm on the stone so that the worm would cut the stone in the way you wanted it to be cut. And only this worm miraculously had the actual power to do it. As I mentioned, however, in the actual Gemara, the Gemara appears in Sota, and it's now on page 3 of the source sheets. The Gemara doesn't actually say that it's an animal. It starts off by saying, the Mishnah taught, from the time when the first temple was destroyed, the Shamir ceased to exist. Right? So after the first Beit HaMikdash, we no longer had the Shamir. The Shamir, the sages taught, was something in which was used by Solomon when he built the temple. And he quotes our verse because he was not allowed to bring metal or anything along those lines. And then the Gemara continues and says, it describes the Shamir. It was the size of a barley corn. It was created in the 6 days of creation. It was one of the miracles that was created at the very end of creation. And nothing hard can withstand it. It's kept because otherwise it will break through everything. They wrap it in sort of tufts of wool, and they place it in a lead vessel full of barley bran, which is soft, and that won't be broken by the Shamir. So, as I said, I think traditionally we think of it as a worm. Rashi is the one who says that it's some type of worm. Rabbi Natan Slifkin, who does a lot of things with animals today, he actually pinpoints a marine mollusk that they found actually also in the Mediterranean that has the ability to really, they found that it is the strongest jaws, per pound in the entire world. And he says maybe that's what the Shamir was, that it actually has the ability to cut through stone. Rabbi Moshe Tendler points out that there are certain type of sort of insect, not quite insect, that exists in the Negev that could chew through the limestone. But Rabbi Slifkin disagrees with him and says, no, but limestone is too thin. In any event, they go back and forth about what it might actually be, that something might have existed. There was a professor, Emanuel Velikovsky, who came up with an interesting theory. He says he doesn't think it was an animal. He thinks it was actually radiation. It was some type of rock, because elsewhere in the Gemara it describes the Shamir as being green, and this maybe some type of rock that emitted radiation. And if you held the stone close to the Shamir, close to the stone, it would cut it by way of radiation. Maybe that's why they put it in lead. I don't know if they understood that concept way back then. Sort of like a kryptonite type of thing. And the reason why it no longer exists after the Beit HaMikdash, because radiation dissipates over time after half-lives, and so it no longer has application. It's interesting. The Shamir is an interesting idea in and of itself. And I would suggest that one of the things that's what it teaches us is, never minimize the small things in life. The Talmud goes out of a way to teach us whatever it was, this incredibly small thing is the only thing that could help us build the Mizbeach and help us connect to God. And certainly we're living in a time now where we all appreciate the power of incredibly small things. In this case, a virus, how it can uproot the entire world. The Shamir is a positive example, something small that is necessary to help us make our creation. And the Gemara has other examples. And one of the sources I brought, I'm going to skip for now, is actually how there are 5 dreaded things in the world. A lion is scared of a particular thing. An elephant is scared of a particular thing. And if you look at that Gemara, all those things that they're scared of are actually very, very small things. So that, I think, is the lesson of the Sota. The lesson in Sota of the Shamir. The problem with relying on this concept of the Shamir, however, is as follows. As the Gemara points out, it was almost miraculous. It was something that was created, Ben Hashmashot, on the 6th day of creation, right before Shabbat. And elsewhere, the Gemara says that everything created then was a sort of after the sin. Adam and Chava have already sinned, and these are the things that were created in order to sort of repair the sins of human beings going forward. So we have a double challenge if we want to rely on the Shamir. One is we usually have the principle of Ein Somchim Al Hanes. We shouldn't need to rely on a miracle in order to serve God. And so here it seems we're relying on a miracle in order to build the Beit HaMikdash. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, it's not even an ideal miracle. It's a miracle that was an after the fact type of solution. So the Shamir, I think, is the traditional answer of how we got around the problem of not bringing iron to cut a stone, but it's not a complete answer. And so there are other answers out there of how you could prepare your stone if you're not going to use iron. One of the answers that appears in that same Gemara in Sota, and if you read in Malachim, you'll see it says it explicitly, that they would quarry the rocks, and they would cut the rocks in Beit Kerem, and then they would bring the rocks, and there was no metal that ever touched the stones once they were in the area of the Beit HaMikdash. In other words, there was metal that touched the stones, but they were out of sight. And if they're out of sight, maybe they're out of mind, kind of similar to the logic we used with bringing a gun into shul. If you cover it, b'diavad, after the fact, maybe it's not such a terrible thing. But there's another way, and that's what I kind of want to focus on and conclude with, of preparing rocks without using metal, right? Fulfilling the specific verse in the Torah without relying on the miracle of the Shamir, which, by the way, is not mentioned in the Torah, but only comes later in the Gemara. So that's the Rambam. The Rambam offers us an explanation, a solution. And by the way, he really, to a certain extent, the solution is in the text itself. Because if you go back to the original source, right, in Shemot, There are two verses. The verse 1 says, Mizbeach adamata sedli. You shall make a mizbeach, an altar, out of earth. It doesn't say anything about a stone. And then it says after that, the mizbeach avanim. But if you decide you have to have a stone mizbeach, then make sure that you don't have any iron go into it. So the Rambam solution is quite easy. The Rambam says, so make your mizbeach out of earth. Don't make it out of stone at all. Okay, it's a problem solved. He then goes on, but if the Torah gives you the option of using stone, okay, if you need to use stone, fine, use the stone, but it should be shalem. It should be totally whole without any carvings whatsoever. And the reason why it should not have any carvings is he explains in the Mor Nevuchim, and that is on the that's on page 4 of the source sheet. In the Mor Nevuchim, he says as follows: the commandment that the stones of the altar should not be hewn, and that no iron tool shall be lifted up upon them, has been explained by our sages as follows. It is not right that the tool that shortens man's life should be lifted up upon that which gives the length of life. As an agadic explanation, this is good, right? He says this is the rabbinic explanation. This is what the Sefer Chinuch gave us. The Rambam says it's a nice teaching, but it's not the real answer. The real answer is as follows. The heathen, the idol worshiper, used to build their altars and with hewn stones, and we should not imitate them. Therefore, we should make our altar out of earth. Thou shalt make unto me an altar of earth. That's what it really says. If it's impossible to dispense with stones altogether, you need the stones, then they cannot be hewn. They must be employed in their totally natural state. They must be whole, without any etchings, without any colors, without anything additional on them. And he says that's what they used to do with Avodah Zarah. With idol worship, they used to mark all of their stones, their temples, with a lot of different things. And so therefore, we want to distinguish ourselves from paganism. And so therefore, we should have complete whole stones. He actually points out that's also the reason for the next mitzvah, mitzvah number 41, where we should have a ramp, right? He says it's also a nice idea that we have the image that the stones might be embarrassed because the Kohen is walking up with like a Scottish kilt, and the stones are going to somehow see the nakedness of the Kohen. He says, but that's not really the reality there either. Our Kohanim, even if they had an open dress, they would sew it up around their legs, almost like pants. I think today it's like Aladdin pants. I don't know if people, Aladdin pants. I don't know if people are familiar with that fashion. In any event, they would sew it up. So there was no nakedness that would have been shown. No, the reason why we had a ramp instead of steps is because that's how the idol worshippers made their altars. They would have steps. They would control nature. They would make it a very sort of formalized structure. And Judaism says the Rambam, we want to get away from that as much as possible. And the Ibn Ezra adds to the Rambam and says, why do we want whole, just the earth or just the natural or the whole stone? We don't want the steps. We don't want the etchings. Not simply because, yes, it's because idol worshippers did it. But what was behind the idol worshippers doing that? What's behind our not doing that? And so he says that when the Ibn Ezra has a long piece on this, says that when you carve a stone, you're showing man's mastery over nature. And right as we approach God, which is through the altar, we should not be making that point of the arrogance of man. We should not be saying, God, we can control everything. You created the world, but you know what? We can make your stones even more beautiful, even stronger. We have to come sort of naturally into what God has produced as nature in itself. It's almost as if we're suggesting that we have power to convince God of the righteousness of our cause, as opposed to simply turning to God and asking for God to believe in the righteousness of us. In other words, it's not about bribing God or showing our power, but rather approaching God with tremendous humility, and therefore we don't change that which God gives us. That's the point of the Ibn Ezra picking up on the Rambam. I want to add with one last idea that picks up a little bit on what the Ibn Ezra said, because the Ibn Ezra argues that it's a little bit about humility before God. If you recall, when I spoke about the the shalom, the peace of the Mizbeach, I also said it's not just between peace between us and God, but also between us and human beings. And therefore, in our relationship with other human beings also requires a certain degree of humility. And I want to go back to a point we were talking about weapons in general. Rav Kook has an interesting insight on weaponry in general. He says weapons have a positive and a negative in this current existence. But in the world to come, it only has a negative. He says, what's the positive and negative in this existence? So he says the negative is clear. There are nations in the world that are very aggressive. They want to try to control the world. They want to try to dominate their neighbors. And they use weapons in order to do this, to crush their neighbors. And by the way, it's not just defeating them physically, it's also defeating them almost spiritually. When a nation conquers another nation, they want to basically say that it's our view of the world, our philosophy, our government, our theology, our culture is superior to yours, and therefore we want to control you. He says that's the negative view of weapons. It's an aggressive perspective. Rav Kook says the positive, of course, is self-defense. He says if you're a nation like Israel, so you don't want weapons, but weapons are a necessary evil because they help you defend yourself. But Rav Kook, of course, is not simply saying it enables you to defend your life. It also enables you to defend your way of life. He feels that Jewish people have something unique to contribute to the whole world. And therefore, it's not simply, if a person says, our nation came and tried to conquer us and says, I'll let you live, no problem. You don't need weapons. I'll even protect you. But you have to follow my way. So Rav Kook would say, well, weapons also help you defend your way of life, your values. And he goes on to say, not just Israel, but every country in the world has something unique to contribute to the world, their way of life. And therefore, they need weapons at this point in time. If there are people who are aggressive, trying to destroy their way of life and only having one way of looking at the world, so then you need weaponry to help defend you from that eventuality. So what I want to conclude with is sort of taking that idea of Rav Kook and thinking about buildings in general. And when I think historically of buildings, to me, the three most impressive buildings historically, at least according to the Bible, I would say one is the Tower of Babel, right? It gets its, what we're in now, it gets its own feature movie in Breshit. The second, of course, are the pyramids in Egypt that we had all the slaves were building, and dedicating their lives and their deaths to this. And then the third, of course, is the Beit HaMikdash. And the question is, what's different between each of these three things? And I think our mitzvah pinpoints the real importance of the difference. The Tower of Babel was built with bricks, right? The Torah tells us specifically it was built with bricks. And there's a practical reason for that. It's much easier to build when every stone is the exact same size, right? It's an easy way of building a symmetrical building. The Netziv, however, goes a step further and says that building with uniform bricks is also symbolic of what that whole society was about, that everyone had to conform to being the same. There couldn't be any differences whatsoever, and people weren't allowed to think differently. And that tower they were building, by the way, was a guard tower to keep everyone in, so no one would escape physically or spiritually. No one would start thinking differently, meet other people and start thinking differently. So they were building a watchtower. That was the real problem of building this tower. And the bricks symbolize the conformity that the rulers wanted. Now go to the pyramids. The pyramids, the Torah also tells us, was used with bricks. And they would make sure that they were also even larger, but that was also, again, the conformity of the stones symbolizes what was required of the people. And I'd go a step further because the Midrash tells us that people, Jews, slaves, were thrown into the bricks, right, to make the bricks. It's as if the Egyptians were destroying not only the life of individual Jews, they're also destroying the uniqueness. They're saying there's no difference between people. They're an interchangeable material entity, right? It's just a material thing. You can just throw them into a stone and that solves that problem. Now you come to the Mizbeach of the Beit HaMikdash, the altar of the Beit HaMikdash. And therefore, I think, is the key distinction. This verse comes right in the center of the 10 commandments before we go to all the Mishpatim and gives us a very important fundamental lesson. you don't need stones at all, right? Use earth, that's preferable, right? Use something natural. But if you're going to use stones, the stones can't be cut, not because, and this is the Ibn Ezra's great insight. He says the word gazit doesn't mean cutting. It means cutting off. It means separating. It's not that you're taking an iron and that's the real problem and you're cutting the stone. The real problem is you're cutting the stone from other stone. You're making it totally conform to your desires and you're making it conform to one another. That every stone is identical and symbolic that every person is identical. And so therefore our mizbeach, when we approach God, is to remind us of the point, here's the humility I was referring to, that every person is different. Every person has their own unique approach to God, as well as to life in general. And we have to respect that by having different size stones, stones that are not perfectly cut, perfectly manicured, right? By having these odd shaped stones, but they're totally whole as they came out of the earth in Beit Kerem. So that's the way we make that very important point of our worshiping God, that it is whole in that regard. And I would just say that's almost the pshat if you think about it. Because what does the Rambam say based upon the Talmud and everything else? The stones that were taken out of the ground, they had to be shalem. No, and those are the ones that had to be used in the Mizbeach. Totally shalem. And of course, what's the root of shalem? Or shalem is the root of what? Shalom, peace. In other words, by having whole stones, that's how you create wholeness amongst people. That's the symbolism, I think, that's taking place and part of the mitzvah of 40 and 41 in the Sefer HaChinuch. So I'm going to end here. I'm happy to answer any quick questions. My wife has another Zoom in about 5 minutes, so I have to switch watching the kids for her at that point in time.
Thank you
You're
very
lucky.
much.
I would have gone on for a few hours, but I have to watch a kid in 5 minutes. Yeah, Nathan, what'd you say?
Thank you very much.
Pleasure, pleasure. So we'll start talking about farming, I think. That's my hope. I haven't looked at it yet. Hopefully I'll find some good stuff and we'll start seeing how that goes next week. And hopefully I'll have some of the technical difficulties solved by then.
Thanks.
Okay, all the best.
Bye.